Hello, BookTube. As you know, I've been doing a weird chapter by chapter read through of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Started out as a sort of buddy read with David Wiley and Tony from An Erudite Adventure. Not sure either one of them is following me into the weeds, but into the weeds we are going as we continue with this bit by bit, section by section read along. And we have finished The Lord of the Rings. We got to the end. Well, I'm back, says Sam Gamgee at the end of an adventure the like of which no hobbit has ever had. We got to the end of the story, a very graceful, very wistful, very beautifully done ending. So those of you who aren't at all familiar with the book, The Lord of the Rings, I'm sure that you're familiar with the movies, but if you're not familiar at all with the book, you might be thinking, well, what more is there to say? You said you'd wrap around to the Fellowship of the Ring, the first part of The Lord of the Rings, and we will. We'll do that chapter by chapter so that somebody down the line can make an absolutely insane playlist, a playlist that's 1,000 videos long. But there is something to do before we get there. And I wanted to do a kind of overview and also general peremptory fight picking before we do it, and that is the appendices. There are appendices at the back of The Lord of the Rings. 100 pages, 6 appendices covering 100 pages. A fine print, so not the same type font as the rest of the book, and not meant to be narrative either. These are appendices in exactly the way that you would see an appendix at the back of a scholarly work of history, because they are meant to continue the conceit that what you're reading in the book, The Lord of the Rings, is a scholarly work of history, is a book being written by someone who is not Tolkien, so one of his characters, a hobbit, probably, or a couple of hobbits. That conceit is paper thin, and it doesn't work. And so I thought before we dig into the appendices, I think I'll spend, Appendix A is rather long, I think I'll spend a few videos on that, then we'll move on from there. Some of them, it's going to be almost impossible to make a video about some of them. But first I thought we'd talk about why they're there at all. Because large works of fiction don't typically have appendices. And there are 2 observations that I want to make about the appendices right away, and one flows from the other. The first observation that I want to make right away is that the appendices are not important at all to The Lord of the Rings. If you're thinking about embarking on reading this book, and you're thinking, well, not only is it 1,000 pages long, but it has 100 pages of appendices at the back. Once upon a time, for a long time, there was a trade paperback of this book that did not include the appendices. If you find that, if you read this without reading them, you are not missing anything at all. You do not need to add them to the weight on the scale of that already represented by this book. That's observation number 1. And observation number 2 flows directly from that, and you Tolkien fanatics are not going to like it. And I want to remind you, I am one of you. I am a Tolkien fanatic. I have been reading and loving this book for a very long time, basically since it appeared. However, the second observation that flows from the first one is that the appendices are a mistake. They are failing on J.R.R. Tolkien's part as an author. They are a failure on his part as an author. And also as an author of the book, and also as a working writer. He bedeviled his publisher with the third volume of this, the third part of this one enormous book. The publisher was going to bring it out in 3 volumes anyway, so we could call it the third volume in a trilogy. It's not. The Return of the King is not the third volume in a trilogy, but you know what I mean. It's the third part of a book. It was always going to be its own book. The publisher was never going to bring out a 1,000-page work of fantasy, not to start with, anyway. And Tolkien was dragging his heels with that third volume, needing to be dunned with letters, which was not the case with him usually. He was a perfectionist, and he was a universalist, so he created a huge world, far bigger than he could work into his book. That's true of a lot of fantasy authors that have followed in his wake, but they don't insist that that larger world be there. They don't insist that it be there. They realize, they come to a professional realization at some point that they can't include all of the undergirding world building, even if they've written it out. They can't include it. It's not part of the dramatic unity of a story. World building is not a story. And most authors who followed in Tolkien's footsteps realized that. And he realized it. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter. He still wanted it to be there. And he dragged his feet about it. And there were arguments between him and his publisher about it. with the publisher and also the publisher's sub-editors saying quite naturally, none of this stuff belongs here. Why are you even including this? There was no internet at the time. There was no website where you could go for the world building specifics that weren't going to be in the book. There weren't any extras that you could add. So if it wasn't, and I'm sure that Tolkien never thought that his son would go on to produce scholarly editions of every single thing that he ever wrote. I'm sure that Tolkien never thought that, or at least had no idea the extent to which it would happen. So he could have thought, well, all of this world building, all of these fragments and bits and pieces and family trees and whatnot, this will all be wasted if I don't include it in the book. Nevertheless, they don't belong. The tiny bits and pieces of the appendices, the stuff that's in the appendices, the tiny bits and pieces of them that have any bearing on the story of Lord of the Rings at all, should be in the Lord of the Rings and could easily have been worked in there. Easily. And the rest of it, well, I don't care if you're having a hard time letting go of it or not. The rest of it does not belong. So you don't include it. You leave it in your papers for some future biographer or archivist, whether it's your son or somebody else, to eventually decide whether or not they want to publish. But you acknowledge, you put on your big boy pants, and you realize this stuff doesn't belong in the story that I'm telling. Tolkien realized that, but he didn't care, and he didn't do it. And it reminds me, believe it or not, of Leonardo da Vinci, who finished the Mona Lisa and couldn't let it go for years. Traveled with the Mona Lisa and told people, anyone who was curious, that it's not quite finished. I'm not quite done with it yet. Simply because he couldn't let it go. That's the same thing that's happening here. And there's no justification for it. I know that Tolkien fanatics, like me, are going to get to the end of The Lord of the Rings. They're going to get to Sam sitting down with his adventure over. And the real world, the new world, the non-magical world beginning. They're going to get to the end of that story and they're going to want more. Oh my God, I want more. Tell me more about the dwarves. Tell me more about the elves. Tell me more about the history of Gondor. Well, they get that. In every standard edition of this book now, you finish with the story and you get 100 more pages in close type telling you the history of Arnor and Gondor, telling you the history of the elves and the dwarves, telling you the rise of Sauron and whatnot, and going into sometimes mind-bogglingly specific detail. But not narrative detail. There are hardly any narrative bits in the appendices. They are there. There are great stories to be told that could be gleaned from the appendices. But they aren't told as stories in the appendices. There are only a couple of places in those 100 pages that come anywhere close. Instead, it's notes. It's notes of the master. It's minutia. It's who succeeded who and what was that person like in one line or half a line. So no time to invest them with any character. Certainly no time to invest any kind of dramatic arc or unity. That's not here in the appendices. Some of you Tolkien fanatics, and again, I want to stress, I'm one of you. Some of you Tolkien fanatics are going to hear that and think, no, that's not true. This is an integral narrative part of The Lord of the Rings. It isn't. It isn't. I wasn't saying that, in my weedy, wibbly, wobbly, timey-wimey opinion, this doesn't work narratively with the body of The Lord of the Rings. I'm saying it doesn't work narratively with the body of The Lord of the Rings. This is not my first rodeo when it comes to critically assessing a book. The appendices do not work. They should not be part of this book. They should be in some scholarly variorum edition of Lord of the Rings, sure. I don't know if Tolkien really thought that such an edition would ever happen, much less that his son would be at the helm of it. But he should have trusted to that. I always worry about this when I'm recommending this book to people who've never read it. I always worry that they're going to look at the length of it and be intimidated anyway. Then they're going to look at the appendices and say, oh my God, so what is this? Is this a work of fantasy that I'm supposed to enjoy and be moved by? Or is this a history of Byzantium, where I have to study the coinage tables at the back to make any sense of the front? They send the wrong message, is what I'm trying to say. And although they are catnip to Tolkien fanatics, they're going to be impenetrable gobbledygook to a newcomer to Tolkien, just like the very beginning of this book is going to be impenetrable gobbledygook. This is why, when it comes to great works of prose, I'm always on guard for the newcomer. I have the same problem with Moby Dick, where I've lost count of how many times someone has said, well, I want to read Moby Dick, but it's awful intimidating. And I know Well, when you get into it, you're going to find that it's even more intimidating than it looks. It's not just the length that's intimidating in Moby Dick. And with a lot of those people over the decades, I have taken their paperback of Moby Dick and put a little pencil mark next to the chapters they can skip. Which sounds like heresy if you love Moby Dick as much as I do, but I wanted to get someone to like the book before I get them to love it. That's a natural step. And the way to do that is to avoid the intimidating parts of it, especially the unnecessarily intimidating parts of it. At least Tolkien puts those parts at the end here and into different type font, so you know clearly what you're doing. You know that you're not reading the story anymore. I just worry that people coming to this new will think I'm reading something important to the story, and you aren't. You absolutely aren't. All of the foreshadowing, all of the forward-facing echoes that lean over the main narrative of this book from the minutiae in the appendices can be appreciated absolutely fine in the book itself, which is a testament to Tolkien's artistic ability. The appendices exist at all is a testament to a failure of his, not a success of his. And again, the Tolkien purists might be tempted to say here, well, the whole book is a book. The whole book it isn't just The Lord of the Rings, it's The Lord of the Rings as written as a book by characters in the story. That doesn't work, and I think you know that. The rest of The Lord of the Rings is not written that way. That conceit is not pursued. Tolkien doesn't write the rest of the book that way. He writes some parts of the appendices that way, but only some. The rest of them, no. So, there's plenty of interesting stuff in these appendices, and we will try to ferret out some bits and pieces of them in the coming days, but I wanted to make a video first telling you what they are and lamenting that they exist. I would be perfectly happy to read these appendices together or scattered in an annotated edition of Lord of the Rings put together by Christopher Tolkien, or in the bits and pieces that he did of The War of the Ring, the multi-volume set of The War of the Ring. I'd be happy to read this stuff either collected or spread around in books like that, but not in this. not in this. We shouldn't be talking about this. They shouldn't be here. We should be moving straight on to the Fellowship of the Ring. But they are here, and they're in this volume, so we're going to deal with them. We will launch into Appendix A next and make our way through, see what we think of them, see what we can find. So I'll see you all for that next time. Thank you, BookTube.